Story outline: The Shadow of Saint Vitus. 1. The Hook, a quiet village on the brink. Setting the scene. Focus: introduce the stark contrast between medieval belief and modern psychology. Setting: the year is 1349, the village of Mülheim, Germany, a few months before the arrival of the Black Death. Character introduction: Ilara, a sensible, grieving widow who exhibits completely normal but misunderstood emotional behaviors. The conflict: a seemingly ordinary act of grief or piety is observed by the local priest, Father Silas, who has recently read influential and sensational texts linking unusual behavior to demonic possession or melancholia. 2. The norms of medieval life interpreted as madness, the core misunderstandings. This section will dive into specific, common behaviors that were pathologized. Intense grief or apathy, modern depression. Ilara's deep sorrow after losing her husband is seen not as natural bereavement, but as melancholia caused by an excess of black bile, or worse, spiritual weakness. Religious ecstasy or obsession, modern OCD or psychosis. A local farmer, Tomas, is extremely rigorous and anxious about sin, a form of scrupulosity. His ceaseless prayer and self-flagellation are seen as potential signs of a daemon driving him to madness, not just extreme piety. Hyperactivity or uncontrolled movement, Saint Vitus dance. Introduce the strange historical phenomenon of dancing manias. This was likely mass psychogenic illness or possibly early neurological disorders, but the narrative will focus on the belief that these people were cursed, demonically compelled, or driven mad by music. The story will link a young boy, Lucas, exhibiting restless leg movements or tics to this growing mania. 3. The diagnosis and cures, historical treatments. The authority. Introduce the figure of the Baron von Kessel, who, though powerful, relies on the local apothecary, barber-surgeon, Brother Alaric, for medical pronouncements. Treatment 1. Humoral theory. Alaric diagnoses Ilara's melancholia. The prescribed cure is bloodletting, severe dietary restriction to balance the black bile, and isolation. Treatment 2. Exorcism. For Tomas's perceived religious mania, Father Silas insists on an intense and traumatic public exorcism, believing the daemon must be cast out. The asylum/isolation. Ilara is briefly confined to the church's small, dark holding room, the early crude precursor to the asylum, for her own protection and the village's safety. 4. The turning point. External reality intervenes. The Black Death. The shift. The Black Death suddenly arrives in Mülheim, shattering the village's focus on spiritual and humoral imbalances. The revelation. The sheer scale of suffering and death normalizes what was previously called madness. Everyone is now exhibiting extreme grief, anxiety, and fear, the very symptoms Ilara was punished for. The apothecary's failure. Brother Alaric's reliance on the four humors proves utterly useless against the plague. His authority collapses. 5. Resolution and reflection. A new perspective. Ilara's role. Because she was already isolated and accustomed to suffering, Ilara, ironically, is one of the few to maintain a degree of sanity and practicality amidst the chaos. She uses her isolation to help nurse the sick, realizing her madness was just normal human sorrow in an abnormal time. The epilogue. Years later, Ilara survives. The story reflects on how the medieval era, lacking our understanding of neurology and psychology, turned natural human responses like grief, anxiety, and religious devotion into terrifying medical and spiritual conditions. Concluding thought for the USA audience. A final powerful statement drawing a parallel to the past and modern times, a reminder that we must always be vigilant about how society defines normal and how quick we are to fear what we don't understand. The shadow of Saint Vitus, when sorrow was seen as sin. In 1349, in the small, timber-framed villages of the Rhine Valley, there was no such thing as clinical depression, generalized anxiety, or obsessive-compulsive disorder. There was only madness, a dark, fearful affliction that could spring from imbalance, the moon, or, most terrifyingly, the insidious whisper of a daemon. What we now recognize as perfectly normal human reactions to grief, stress, or devotion were then seen as spiritual failures, humoral curses, or the mark of Satan. Before the darkness of the Black Death swept across Europe, a more subtle terror already held sway, the terror of simply being too human. This is the story of Mulheim, a place where a quiet tear could be mistaken for a declaration of war against God, and where piety itself became a prison. 1. The quiet village on the brink, Ilara's melancholia. The air in Mulheim was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It was a cold spring in the year of our Lord 1349, and while the whispers of the plague, the great mortality as some called it, were still just distant rumors from the Italian ports, the village carried its own quiet burden of suffering. Our story begins with Ilara, a woman barely 30, whose husband, a sturdy weaver named Berthold, had been taken by a swift, relentless fever just after Christmas. In our time, Ilara's behavior would be deemed entirely appropriate. She was grieving. She moved through her days in a gray haze. She spoke little, her eyes often fixed in the middle distance. She ate only when prompted and worked her loom with a slow, mechanical precision that lacked her previous spark. She wept most often at dusk, a quiet, contained sorrow that she did not inflict upon others. To the village of Mulheim, however, Ilara was not grieving. She was suffering from melancholia. The word, whispered by the stern women of the church subtlety, was drawn from the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through the fearful lens of the church, an excess of atra bile, black bile, a cold, dry humor that saturated the soul, chilling devotion and breeding spiritual despair. "Look at her, sitting by the hearth," muttered Magda, the baker's wife, crossing herself vigorously. "She refuses to laugh, even at Father Silas's parables. Does she not know that joy is a gift from God? Her sorrow insults the Lord who provides." This was the terrifying trap. In the medieval worldview, emotional extremes, either ecstasy or profound sadness, were rarely attributed to the simple chemistry of the brain. They were moral or physical imbalances. Ilara's profound lack of joy, her natural, necessary period of intense mourning, was not seen as normal bereavement. It was interpreted as a moral failure. She was spiritually weak, unwilling to accept God's will, and therefore vulnerable to the temptations of acedia, spiritual sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. A physical threat. The black bile must be purged before it turned her mood so poisonous it could infect the community's spiritual well-being. Father Silas, a man of rigid piety and limited empathy, watched Ilara closely. He had read a recent fear-mongering tract from a traveling scholar, a text that suggested sudden, dark moods in women were often the first sign of a lesser daemon seeking entry. Ilara's quiet withdrawal was proof enough. The daemon was feeding on her despair. 2. The norms of medieval life interpreted as madness. Tomas and the curse of piety. If Ilara's stillness was alarming, the opposite behavior in the village was also causing panic. Enter Tomas, a farmer of 40, known for his diligent, if somewhat anxious nature. Tomas was desperately afraid of sin, Not the grand, obvious sins, but the tiny, secret ones. He would obsessively recount his day before sleeping, terrified he forgot to confess a single impure thought, a missed moment of grace, or a fractional inaccuracy in his tithe. In modern terms, Tomas was displaying clear signs of scrupulosity, a form of religious obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, where intrusive, anxiety-provoking thoughts center around moral or religious fears. His behavior was meticulous. He would pray the Pater Noster exactly 7 times before touching his morning bread, believing the bread would be poisoned if he prayed 6 or 8 times. He would return to the church 3 or 4 times after the evening bell, convinced he had forgotten to properly genuflect before the altar rail, leaving the entire village vulnerable to divine wrath. He would wash his hands raw before and after touching the communion cup, an act of hygiene born from spiritual anxiety, not physical necessity. To Father Silas and the villagers, Tomas's ceaseless, repetitive rituals were not signs of anxiety, they were evidence of a dark external pressure. "The adversary torments him," Father Silas preached from the pulpit, his voice echoing in the cold stone church. "See how his prayers are unending, yet they bring him no peace. The demon twists his devotion into an anchor of despair. It is not piety, it is mania." Tomas's intense, painful devotion was pathologized. The sheer volume of his compulsive prayer was seen as evidence that a demon had seized his will and was forcing him into these exhausting, endless routines to mock God and destroy Tomas's health. He was no longer seen as a pious man struggling with his faith. He was seen as a possessed man struggling against his own soul. 3. The diagnosis and cures, balancing bile and drawing blood. The authority in Mülheim was split between the political power of Baron von Kessel and the medical authority of Brother Alaric, the barber surgeon. Brother Alaric relied wholly on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. The treatment for Ilara, or melancholia. When Ilara's continued apathy was brought before him, Alaric confirmed the diagnosis, melancholia. "The black bile is thick in her," Alaric pronounced, examining her pallid skin and slow pulse. "It chills her spirit and makes her heart heavy. It is cold and dry and must be countered." The prescribed cure: bloodletting. Ilara was subjected to bloodletting, a common treatment for nearly every ailment. A vein was opened in her arm to draw off the tainted blood that was believed to be carrying the excess black bile. The loss of blood, of course, did not balance her humors, but likely made her feel weaker and more depressed. Dietary restriction. She was placed on a restrictive diet of warm, moist foods, like boiled chicken and thin gruel, to counteract the cold, dry nature of the bile. Foods deemed cold or dark, like pork or certain vegetables, were forbidden. Ilara was confined to a small, dark storage room in the back of the church's sacristy. This small, unventilated room served as Mülheim's informal, rudimentary asylum, a place not for healing, but for containing the unpredictable. Ilara's grief, her most human reaction, led to her terrifying isolation. The treatment for Tomas, mania or possession. Tomas's case was deemed more spiritual than physical. Father Silas believed his rituals were not caused by an imbalance of humors, but the direct malicious force of a demon. The prescribed cure: exorcism. Father Silas arranged an immediate public exorcism. It was a terrifying spectacle. Tomas was bound to a wooden stool, while Father Silas read the frightening Latin rites, waving a crucifix and demanding the evil spirit name itself. Tomas, already prone to high anxiety, became hysterical under the pressure, screaming, writhing, and begging for mercy. This reaction, far from proving him sane, was taken as absolute proof that the demon was fighting to remain within him. Physical discipline. As part of the cleansing, Tomas was prescribed a regimen of self-flagellation, using a small knotted cord to strike his own back, to drive out the evil through physical pain and humility. The pain, intended as a spiritual cure, simply reinforced his cycle of fear and self-punishment.
The rising terror, St. Vitus's dance. The fear of madness reached its crescendo with the behavior of Lucas, a shepherd boy of 12. Lucas was fidgety. He often tapped his feet rhythmically, twitched his neck slightly when anxious, and found it difficult to stand still during long masses. Today, a modern physician might suggest a mild tic disorder or restlessness. In 1349 Mülheim, however, his movements were becoming linked to an alarming, widespread phenomenon known as St. Vitus's dance, or the dancing mania. In the towns downstream of Mülheim, reports were pouring in. Crowds of people, sometimes hundreds strong, were seemingly compelled to dance uncontrollably, leaping, jerking, and twitching until they collapsed from exhaustion. This was likely a form of mass psychogenic illness driven by famine, terror, and superstition. When Lucas's simple tics were observed by the increasingly terrified villagers, they saw not a nervous child, but a precursor. "The devil's tune is in his legs," cried Magda. "It is the curse of the dance. He is possessed by the spirit of frantic movement." The boy's normal, perhaps slightly hyperactive behavior became terrifying evidence that the town itself was under a spiritual attack. He was sequestered immediately, tied to his bed to prevent the contagion of the dancing madness from spreading. His fear and confusion only exacerbated his restlessness, further proving the villagers' dreadful diagnosis. The most mundane human expressions, grief, Ilara, anxiety, Tomas, and restlessness, Lucas, had all been successfully redefined as medical or demonic pathology, locking away the innocent and punishing the normal. 5. The turning point, external reality, intervenes. Then the whispers became reality. In the late summer of 1349, a cart driven by a man with swollen black lumps beneath his chin and a wild, feverish stare arrived in Mülheim. The Black Death had come. The speed and horror of the plague instantly shattered the villagers' neat, terrifying theories of madness. Suddenly, everyone was exhibiting the symptoms Ilara had been punished for. Profound grief. Families were wiped out in days. The entire village was plunged into a sorrow far deeper than Ilara's initial mourning. No one had the luxury of calling this melancholia. It was simply survival. Intense anxiety and ritual. As death became arbitrary, villagers began performing desperate compulsive rituals to ward off the disease. They burned pungent herbs, wore strange amulets, and prayed ceaselessly, behaving exactly like Tomas. But their behavior was now sanctioned, necessary defense. His mania became the new norm. Panic and frenzy. Fear drove many to hysterical flight, screaming, and uncontrolled movement. Lucas's tics were forgotten as people fled their homes, their frantic, unthinking rush to escape being the truest expression of the dancing mania, but this time it was recognized as pure, rational terror. The collapse of authority. Brother Alaric's humoral theory proved utterly useless against the Black Death. His bloodletting only weakened the sick,
and his careful balancing of cold and moist humors was meaningless against the relentless virulence of the plague. His medical authority vanished in a week. Father Silas, too, found his spiritual pronouncements failing as the righteous and the sinful died side by side. Ilara's redemption. Paradoxically, Ilara's isolation saved her. Having been already cast out and forced to cope with profound sorrow, she possessed a hardened resolve and an immunity to the initial hysteria. When the village was paralyzed by fear and confusion, Ilara, released from her dark room, moved with quiet purpose. She had endured the worst kind of isolation, the kind where her own feelings were weaponized against her. Now she was simply another mourner, and her deep, contained grief was finally understandable. She used her energy to fetch water for the sick and bury the dead, realizing that her madness had been nothing more than normal human sorrow in an abnormal, ignorant time. Conclusion: the shadow lifted. The Black Death, the greatest calamity of the medieval world, ironically brought a temporary, brutal clarity. It demonstrated that human suffering, whether physical or emotional, was a universal burden, not a spiritual curse confined to a few. The behaviors that had once been pathologized as unique, terrifying madness, grief, anxiety, deep devotion, and restlessness were revealed to be the very fabric of the human experience under stress. Ilara survived. Thomas, too, survived, though scarred by his exorcism. Lucas, the restless boy, was finally allowed to move freely. They carried the knowledge that society, in its fear and ignorance, had turned their normal humanity into a medical and spiritual crime. To the modern audience, this tale is a powerful mirror. It reminds us that societies often demonize or medicalize what they do not understand, whether it is sorrow, anxiety, or neurodiversity. The greatest fear is not the illness itself, but the label we impose upon the afflicted.
The terrifying remedies, curing the body with fear. The first devastating wave of the Black Death had passed, leaving Mulheim decimated but alive. The villagers had gained a hard-won, temporary clarity on emotional suffering, but when it came to physical illness, the old fears and the bizarre practices of medieval medicine quickly resurfaced, intensified by the constant threat of sickness. Brother Alaric, the barber surgeon, though humiliated by the plague, still held the tools and the traditional knowledge. His remedies for common ailments were as astonishing and alarming as his cures for melancholy. 6. The cure for the fiend in the head, headaches and epilepsy. Headaches, often chronic and severe, were a common complaint in a time of poor diet, constant stress, and heavy labor. Today, we treat them with rest and pain relievers. In Mulheim, a persistent, throbbing headache was not a simple ailment. It was often viewed as a physical entrapment of an evil spirit, or worse, the head being overwhelmed by putrid vapors. A young woman named Hilda, a laundress known for her quick wit, began suffering from intense, debilitating migraines after the plague had claimed her mother. The cure: trepanning, the ultimate surgical risk. Brother Alaric, now desperate to regain his reputation, diagnosed Hilda with a dangerous buildup of corrupt air in her skull, arguing that the vapor was pressing on her brain and causing the pain. His proposed remedy was trepanning, drilling a hole into the patient's skull to allow the evil vapors, or perhaps the small demon responsible for the pain, to escape. Note for the USA audience: trepanning was a brutally risky procedure, sometimes performed with astounding precision, as evidenced by healing bone around ancient holes, but mostly done with horrific results.
It was based on the belief that a physical opening was necessary to release pressures or entities causing mental or physical distress. Hilda, fearing the agonizing pain of the drill, was thankfully spared by a delay. But the very thought of the procedure, a deliberate act of cranial trauma to cure a headache, highlights the astonishing risk patients were expected to endure for even the simplest pain. The cure was often far more life-threatening than the condition itself. 7. The madness of the sacred disease, epilepsy. The most fearful and misunderstood physical affliction was epilepsy, then known throughout Europe as the sacred disease, morbus sacer. This condition, characterized by sudden, violent seizures, was viewed with profound terror. When a local miller, Rolf, suffered a grand mal seizure, falling to the ground, convulsing and frothing at the mouth, the villagers did not see a neurological event. They saw the moon's curse. He was a lunatic, lunaticus, his fits controlled by the changing phases of the moon, which was believed to directly influence the humors and the brain. Possession by the fallen. The seizure was considered the ultimate manifestation of a demon wrestling for control of the soul, throwing the body into spasms as it fought.
The cures, fearful charms, and ritual humiliation. The treatment for Rolf was a terrifying mix of folk magic and painful rituals, designed not to heal the body, but to scare the evil spirit away. The corpse cure, a widely believed, though rarely practiced cure, involved drinking a potion containing human blood or consuming the pulverized skull of a person who had died a violent death, believed to possess protective, anti-demonic energy. Amulets of terror. Rolf was forced to wear a protective amulet carved from mistletoe, hung around his neck with a chain of iron, metal being seen as a deterrent to spirits, or even a small, sealed bag containing the fingernail clippings of a hanged man. The rationale was that the spiritual darkness of the hanged man would frighten off the lesser demon causing the fits. The ritual of public denial. Rolf was publicly humiliated. Father Silas made him swear before the entire village that he had engaged in no recent sin, thus trying to shame the demon into leaving. The shame and anxiety only compounded Rolf's stress, potentially increasing the likelihood of future seizures. 8. The cure for insomnia. The potion of forgetfulness. Insomnia, or the inability to sleep, was particularly troubling because sleep was seen as the time when the soul was most vulnerable to spiritual attack. A person who couldn't sleep was often seen as someone whose daemon was actively keeping them awake to plot against God. The cure. Opium and mandrake, the poisonous lullaby. For those suffering from sleeplessness, like the elderly Dame Agnes, whose lack of rest was simply a sign of age and worry, Brother Alaric mixed his most powerful and most dangerous compound, a thick, syrupy brew made from opium poppies and mandrake root. While these herbs did induce sleep, the dosing was imprecise and deadly. Mandrake was known for its narcotic and hallucinogenic properties, and incorrect dosing could lead to stupor, severe disorientation, and death. The medieval physician, in his attempt to calm the soul, was often delivering a potentially fatal dose of poison. Agnes, upon taking the potion, slept for 2 days straight, a cure that terrified her family more than her wakefulness. 8. A new wave of madness. The dancing mania returns. As the initial terror of the plague subsided, the pervasive anxiety remained. Fear, grief, and spiritual confusion became a fertile ground for the ultimate mass psychogenic illness, the return of the full-blown dancing mania. In the summer following the plague, a traveler stumbled into Mulheim, his face pale and his clothes ripped, claiming he had fled a village where hundreds were dancing. This time, the madness struck closer to home.
Several villagers, led by the previously anxious farmer Thomas, whose trauma had been reinforced by his exorcism, began to exhibit uncontrollable movements, jerking and stamping. The medieval response: music and coercion. The official response to this actual hysterical outbreak was both cruel and counterintuitive. Dance it out. Based on the idea that the madness was a hot affliction that needed to be expelled through exertion, those afflicted were often coerced to continue dancing. Piper musicians were hired to play fast, loud tunes to drive the dancers to exhaustion, believing the daemon would be defeated when the body collapsed. The saint's shrine. The afflicted were often marched or carried hundreds of miles to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Strasbourg, the belief being that only the specific intervention of this patron saint could halt the compulsive, terrifying movements. The journey itself was often fatal. The villagers had confused grief with melancholy, anxiety with possession, and epilepsy with lunacy. Now, in the face of mass hysteria rooted in post-plague trauma, their attempts to cure the affliction only reinforced the madness, driving the sick body to its breaking point. Conclusion: the persistent shadow. The story of Mulheim ends not with a clean triumph of sanity, but with a persistent, shadowy reminder. The lack of true knowledge led to the pathologization of human nature. The medieval age was not just cruel, it was profoundly ignorant of the internal mechanisms of the mind and body. The most common human experiences, a throbbing headache, a fit of anxiety, a moment of deep sadness, were distorted by a terrifying system of beliefs rooted in bile, demons, and celestial influences. The remedies, from trepanning to forced ritual dancing, were built on fear, often proving more dangerous than the original complaint. The lesson of Mulheim is clear. The greatest historical irony is that in their desperate attempt to cure what they considered madness, the people of the medieval age only managed to create more suffering, fear, and true mental anguish.
The justice of the bewitched. Animals on trial. The medieval mind, convinced the demons could inhabit humans and influence their behavior, extended this belief to the animal kingdom. If a human could be possessed and driven to madness or unnatural acts, why not a beast? This led to one of the most astonishing practices of the era: animal trials. The notion of holding animals accountable in courts of law, complete with lawyers, witnesses, and judgments, shines a harsh light on the era's deeply superstitious understanding of deviance and free will. 10. The Swine and the Devil's Pact. Animal trials for madness or evil. Our story returns to the village of Mulheim, now a few years after the initial plague, its population slowly recovering, but its superstitions deeply ingrained. One blustery autumn morning, a peasant woman named Goethe discovered her infant, Jakob, severely injured in his crib. A sow belonging to the neighboring farmer had somehow gotten into the house and attacked the child. The sow was known to be a particularly aggressive animal, prone to erratic behavior. Today, we would attribute this to animal instinct, poor containment, or a desperate, starving animal. In medieval Mulheim, the explanation was far more sinister. The sow was possessed by a daemon or had been bewitched by a malicious sorcerer. Her unnatural aggression was not simply animal behavior, it was evidence of evil. The trial: justice for a bewitched beast. The Baron von Kessel, still wielding his authority, though now with a more cautious demeanor after the plague, decreed that the sow must face trial. This was not a unique occurrence. Across Europe, pigs, rats, insects, and even snails were routinely brought before secular and ecclesiastical courts. Note for the USA audience, the legal system of medieval Europe often granted animals legal standing, believing they possessed a limited form of moral agency. The underlying logic was that if animals could be tempted by the devil or act as instruments of sorcery, then they could be held responsible for their crimes. The trial of Mülheim sow was a chilling spectacle. The accused, the sow, mud-stained and grunting, was brought into the improvised courtroom, the village square, tethered and surrounded by a nervous crowd. The prosecutor, Father Silas, still eager to assert moral authority, acted as the accuser, arguing that the sow's act was not one of mere animal instinct, but of malice, driven by infernal forces. He cited biblical passages about swine and demons. The defense, a young, inexperienced advocate, Brother Thomas, was appointed to defend the sow. His argument was pitiable. Perhaps the sow was merely hungry or had been provoked, but his defense was weak against the weight of superstition. The verdict, after much deliberation and citing of precedents from other animal trials, the sow was found guilty of malicious assault, her madness attributed to a demonic influence.
The punishment: execution and excommunication. The punishment for the possessed sow was swift and brutal. Execution: the sow was condemned to death by hanging. The public execution was meant to be a terrifying deterrent, a visual lesson against the influence of evil. The act was not just about killing a dangerous animal, it was about purging a possessed vessel from the community. Excommunication for the remains. In some extreme cases, though not in Mülheim for the sow, animals were even excommunicated from the church, ensuring their bodies could not be buried in consecrated ground, further emphasizing their demonic connection. The curse of the vermin, pestilence and demonic infestation. The concept of animal madness or possession extended beyond domestic animals. When pests like rats and insects plagued the villagers, devastating crops or spreading disease, though the connection wasn't fully understood, they too were brought before the church in a different kind of legal proceeding, excommunication for vermin. Mülheim, like any medieval village, struggled with rats, especially after the plague. They were seen not just as carriers of disease, which they were, but as demonic agents sent by the devil to torment the faithful. The legal battle against the rats. Father Silas, again at the forefront, conducted a formal ecclesiastical trial against the rats. The summons. A formal summons was read from the pulpit, demanding the rats of Mülheim appear in court to defend themselves against charges of destruction and blasphemy. The defense. Again, a lawyer, often the same Brother Thomas in a truly bizarre legal tradition, would be appointed to represent the rats. He would argue that the rats could possibly not understand the summons, that they were simply following God's natural laws, or that their crimes were due to human negligence, for example, poor food storage. The verdict. Unsurprisingly, the rats were always found guilty. The sentence. Father Silas would then pronounce a formal excommunication against all the rats of Mülheim, banishing them from the village and forbidding them from consuming its produce. He would scatter holy water and incense, believing that the spiritual banishment would physically drive the rats away. Note for the USA audience. While these trials seem absurd to us, they were taken extremely seriously. They demonstrated a medieval belief in a deeply interconnected world, where the spiritual and natural realms constantly intertwined, and even animals were subject to divine and demonic influence. These trials were attempts to impose human order and spiritual authority on a chaotic, threatening natural world. Conclusion: a world bewitched. The animal trials of the medieval period are perhaps the most striking illustration of a society struggling to comprehend the natural world. Unable to grasp concepts like zoology, pest control, or neurology, they resorted to legal and theological frameworks.
The madness of an aggressive sow or the evil of destructive rats was seen not simply as biology or ecological imbalance. It was evidence of a world constantly under siege by malevolent forces. By putting animals on trial, medieval people tried to impose order on the incomprehensible, making demons rather than disease or instinct the culprits for everything that went wrong. It was a world where fear and superstition cast a long, bewildering shadow, turning normal animal behavior into a chilling legal drama.